The southern quarter of the city was built around the Temple of Justice. The temple was built on a large ziggurat, many stairs carved in with ancient feet and by ancient masons, led up to where the judges heard the cries of the city and where people can have their voices heard in the name of justice. Disagreements between neighbors are heard, alongside the cases of criminal wrongdoing. The judges were once priests of justice, asked to be fair and asked above all to be understanding. In Shango's name, they were asked not merely to punish the wicked, but to also heal the harmed, to aid the starving, to truly understand justice. Restitution, rehabilitation, reimbursement were words that often echoed across the halls of the Temple of Justice. Ideas were debated and people argued over what was or wasn't fair. Words were meant to be held and shared. Every case was case by case. It was chaotic, it was slow, and it was justice. One of the few places where the meek could take down the mighty, where the wealthy could be forced to pay the poor, where the thief is charitable, where the killer gets to be a victim, where fights can end in embraces. It was justice. It wasn't always popular, it wasn't always kind, and not everyone left happy, and sometimes everyone left unhappy. It was justice. When the patriarch came to power, the temple was reformed, and so was everyone inside. As unification became the law of the land, numerous new laws were written in stone, laws that were more fluid than ink on a page. Loyal supporters of the patriarch brought their concerns to the Temple of Justice, and when they thought that justice wasn't enough for them, they sought out assistance from the patriarch, who replaced more and more of the priests with different bureaucrats that once helped manage the patriarch's forces. Now they replaced the priest judges of the temple with bureaucrat judges, who were loyal to the patriarch first, gold second, and themselves last. Still, many of the priest judges still chose to represent as priest lawyers, defendants for those who weren't wealthy enough for representation. Although the old priests were not entirely out of the temple, since they were still acting as lawyers and representatives. They weren't always listened to, they weren't always successful, but they weren't always failures either. Adansi walked through the crowded streets of the southern quarter by walking along the stone benches that lined the streets, while most of the crowds below chose to stick to the paths everyone chose. She chose the path less walked, and she found it made all the difference. As she got further from the palace, the streets grew more crowded as she got closer to the Temple of Justice. To call the Temple of Justice a single building was vastly misleading. It was a massive campus on top of the ziggurat, with numerous buildings, each with their own branch of law represented, and with different crowds around each building. One of the first buildings Adansi passed was the Cura Court, the court that distributed the flower supply for the citizens of the city. The Cura Court was recently built, an invention of the patriarch. The line was long an hour before the Cura Court opened, and it remained an hour after it closed. Many citizens of the city depended on the patriarch's patronage to afford flour to feed their families. The process of the Cura Court once began during the Unification War to feed the families who had members of their families fighting for the patriarch. After the wars, the process continued, feeding thousands of citizens across Stromer, even as the Cura was essential to the citizens. It was often debated amongst the oligarchs of Sipoli. Some of the oligarchs thinking that the cura was too minimal to truly alleviate hunger, since it was only for citizens, and others who considered the cura to be too much. And then there were those who considered the cura to be too expensive to have started in the first place. And yet, despite all of the debates in the palace, the citizens still lined up outside the cura court, and the patriarch's coffers still lightened to fatten the larders of the citizens. Outside the cura court, none of the priest judges tried to debate the good of the cura, and they left the bureaucrat judges inside alone. Some of these judges even offered a place in Shango's court for what they did. Adansi passed the cura court with a smile on her face as she saw the other courts. She also saw the dowry court. It was recently updated. The painting up front once showed Shango and Ocean standing next to each other. Now it was painted over. It showed a representation of Ocean holding twins in her arms over her pregnant belly. The line wasn't as long as the cura court, but nearly everyone in the line was a tired-looking woman with children either in their arms, by their sides, or in their stomachs. Officially, it was called the Court for Unmarried Women. It was commonly known as the Court of Dowry before the patriarch's takeover, and most people preferred the old name over the official name. When women of Sipoli had children out of wedlock, it was difficult to force the fathers to help raise the children or even help with costs. So it was here where justice, alongside love, found a way to help these single mothers. Taxes were collected among all of the men of Stromer in two different forms. Once per year in their annual tithe to the Temple of Love, commonly known as the widow's wage, and also when men visited a brothel, the tithe would be collected from the men in what was known as the lust fund. When the patriarch took over, however, and the Temple of Love was shut down, the services were folded into the Temple of Justice, and the Court of Dowry was now called the Courts for Unmarried Women. For the most part, there was little change anyone could see. Tithes became taxes, priest judges became bureaucrat judges, dowries were renamed into grants, and yet the idea remained the same. If the father could be any man in Stromer, then all of the men of Stromer would pay for the children. Still, as helpful as the grants were, a lot of the women were exhausted in the line. Money could pay for a lot, but it couldn't cover everything. And even though things were supposed to be clear-cut, even here Adansi could see those who fell between the cracks of the patriarch's paved roads. A lot of the mothers in the line were children themselves. Children who were exhausted of being mothers and who still had to stand in line with everyone else to make their case before the bureaucrat judges and explain why children needed a portion of the widow's wages and lust fund to help pay for their own children. And they would also have to prove to the bureaucrat judges that the children in their arms were their own children and not merely their younger siblings. Judges who desperately wanted these children to be lying, because if the children were telling the truth, then the bureaucrat judges would have to witness a world where the innocent child is a myth. Still, as much as Adansi wanted to stop and keep these children company, she saw that her job was already taken care of. Priest judges walked among the line, offering advice to those who asked for it, listening to their cases as they explained how to fill out paperwork and the best way to frame their argument. And priestesses of Ocean also wandered the line, offering to help play with the children Others offered to stand in line for a time so the mothers could rest, and others still returned with food and drink from nearby carts. Even when Ocean gave up and hid beneath the shadow market, her priests and priestesses continued their duties the best they could, offering small acts of comfort and love in a harsh world. Adansi even noticed one woman with several piercings in her face travel up and down the line, offering tea to the women in line. Tea served from a teapot that never cooled, never emptied, and always had your favorite flavor. Adansi did a subtle nod to Ocean as she passed by the court of dowry, and Ocean nodded back. Adansi was glad that Ocean found meaning and kindness again in the Temple of Justice, although Adansi would have to continue with her plans if she wanted to make sure that the gods would feel welcome again in their new temples. Adansi passed by many more different courts as she headed for the oldest part of the Temple of Justice. She passed by the Court of Alliance, formerly the Court of Marriage, a place where people could announce their marriage to the government of Psipolis. Useful for legal purposes, far more useful for economic reasons. A married couple meant that one person could work and the other could raise the children. Once managed by Ocean's temple, it was now folded into Shango's temple with the unification. Next to the Court of Alliance was the Court of Inheritance, the next court that people went to after marriage to dictate where their assets and wealth would flow after their death. While there was no line outside this court, people would spend days or even months figuring out how the inheritance would flow. And in the center of the Temple of Justice was the original Temple of Justice, one of the oldest remaining buildings still remaining in Psipolis. An open-air amphitheater with two different podiums where the accused and the accuser can face each other. The judges sit in the amphitheater, listening to what is happening as they vote on who is guilty. Once upon a time, they used thunderstones, glass rocks made from where lightning struck sand, on a scale to show where the votes were going, whether it was for the accused or the accuser. These days, though, they no longer use thunderstones. They use blocks of gold. Some blocks were full of gold, and others were hollow. The wealthy could bribe the right bureaucrat judge and then have them change out a few blocks of gold for hollow blocks to work the scales their way. Once upon a time, Shango's statue stood in the center of the amphitheater, holding scales in one hand, and in the other hand, a double-headed axe. Now that statue was gone, where once a statue of the king of the Stromerian god stood. Instead, now there was a statue of the patriarch. The symbolism of replacing the king of the gods with the symbol of the patriarch was not lost on anyone. It was especially not lost on those arguing their cases beneath the watchful eyes of the statue and the bureaucrat judges in the seats. Adansi quietly sat down in an empty seat as she watched the case. The accuser's lawyer, a well-paid bureaucrat judge, explained to the court that his herds of Ouranosauruses were growing ill by eating the hops from the fields of the accused. The court listened as the accused was near tears before finally being given a chance to speak with the help of a priest judge. The priest judge, with a necklace of red and white, as the accused lawyers spoke with clarity and confidence, that rang out to the farthest seats of the amphitheater with ease, and reminded Adansi of thunder on a clear day. There are no agreement of the Ouranosauruses to eat in my client's fields. The agreement was for the fence to be maintained, that any food that falls over the fence is fair for the Ouranosaurus to consume. However, the accuser has not maintained their side of the fence, and over half of the hop fields have been consumed. While the illness of the herds is a sad consequence of breaching the fence, they were not kept on their own side, and they grew ill by tearing up another's fields. If my children broke into my neighbor's pantry and drank themselves sick on my neighbor's beer, that doesn't fault my neighbor for having beer. I will still have to pay to replace the beer that my children drank, Shango explained to the court as the bureaucrat judges listened, nodding as they thought about it, and the accuser began to look nervous, and the accused looked relieved. As the audience conferred, they began to place their gold bars on the scales. Adansi watched in silence as a lot of gold bars were placed in favor of the accused, as the scale showed favor towards the farmer who had his hops fields eaten. Now he was seen as innocent. It was now time to confer over what is, or isn't, fair punishment. The bureaucrat judges discussed among themselves as they figured out what was or wasn't fair, while the lawyers stood with their clients as the bureaucrat judges conferred and then spoke to both the defendant and the prosecutor. We have decided it is only fair that the loss of the fields will need to be compensated. So, at season's end, we will evaluate how many hops are growing, and the accuser will compensate 3 times the amount of hops that are growing, the bureaucrat judge said as the accused sighed. Season's end is winter. There will be no hops growing at all. Why not evaluate it now so you can understand how bad the damage is? The accused asked as the judge who gave the ruling shrugged and turned away. We have to prepare for the Odo festival, and you should be glad we are seeing it so soon, the bureaucrat judge said as they turned away to adjourn. As the accuser was relieved, and Adansi could notice as a few guilty were exchanged between the accuser and the bureaucrat judges, while Shango spoke to the accused. Adansi approached. As she got close, she could hear Shango give directions to the accused. Plant a thunderstone in your field and leave it be. Hops will grow in time for the bureaucrat judge to see it, Shango said as the accused thanked the god of thunder as he turned away, and the accused, realizing Shango was busy, he scurried off, and Shango turned to Adansi, and they were both silent for a moment before he pointed out to the carts just outside of the court. Hungry? He asked Adansi, who smiled and nodded as they went to one of the carts. Served from a large pot, 2 clay bowls were filled with a stew of shrimp and okra for both of the gods. As they ate the delicious stew, and they watched the complex lives wander around them. People are complex beings, even in a large crowd where everyone looks so similar. Their internal lives are so very different as the 2 gods quietly drink directly from their bowls. They watched as one single mother with 3 children stood in line, her feet sore as she switched foot to foot to avoid getting blisters. She isn't aware that her children bite their lips the same way that she does. Just behind her, a man stands in line with his pregnant daughter. He is aware of the stares of those around him settled on both him and his daughter. Still, he stands in line, free of shame, supporting his daughter in the court of dowry, making sure that she gets treated fairly, even if everyone stares at them both. Even among the priestesses who wander in the lines trying to see how they can help, there are rich lives among them. Adansi saw one priestess, a mother herself, also keep an eye on her own children who also wander the lines trying to offer aid, also trying to help out. Starting out as helping out their mother, but now they are here to help people. Adansi could see these children wander these lines as young children, and she can see them as parents themselves and as grandparents, still wandering these same lines and inspiring many others to wander these lines to aid others. Justice exists in many forms, from the highest court of thousands to between two who decide to be honest with each other, Shango said as he finished his bowl and Adanse finished as well, placing her bowl on his bowl. It does, and it helps when you are still a part of it. I am sorry they tried to make you leave. Glad to see you're still so persistent, Adanse told Shango, who smiled with a crackle of ozone in the air. Unlike the other gods of Stromer, Shango was always a god. He was never a person. Even as the world changed around him, he was still the same. The bureaucrat judges aren't so bad. They introduced the cura that feeds so many citizens. They help manage the paperwork that leaves courts afloat. However, they don't see justice as a case-by-case basis. They don't see why people need to share their stories. They see the laws as something that binds, not something that protects. Still, even they deserve a chance to see what law is about. Although it's hard to do when justice is in the patriarch's shadow, he said, pointing towards the statue of the patriarch. So, what is your plan for fixing everything? Adanse asked Shango as he shrugged. Well, I was thinking about striking the patriarch statue with lightning during a case, having all of the gold bars turned to lead, maybe have a bureaucrat judge kiss iron only for the iron to turn hot so they can no longer speak lies. Things like that, with how much they are pushing against me, Shango said, reminiscing about all of the dramatic ways he could make his point. Do you really think that would work? Adanse asked Shango, who shook his head. I doubt it. Had one judge hit with lightning last year. He was replaced in a day, only for the next judge to be struck by lightning again. Did this for about a week. They weren't even worried. They were just excited to be in charge. Gotta love men's faith in their own titles, Shango said with a sigh, before Adanse sighed as well. Yeah, mustard seeds and all that. They tend to grow anywhere and spread all over. You can't smother them, nor should you try to do so. The more you try, the more it spreads, Adanse told the king of the Stromerian gods, who turned to her and said, What do you recommend that I try, then? He asked as the child god turned out over the courts and she pointed out the newer ones. If you don't like what your fields are growing, you don't burn them down. You don't remove everything that's growing. If you did something like that, the only thing that grows is lichen and weeds until the topsoil returns. And does that sound like justice to you? She asked the husband of Ocean, who shook his head as she started to point out at the older cords, lining them up with her hand like she was doing a finger gun, an action that would never be recognized on Primeval. What you do is you plant the seeds you want to grow. You let those seeds grow, and they will take over the place of the crop you want gone. It takes time, it takes patience, and it is rarely fun, but in the end it serves the world better, and it lets the world grow from unjust to just, from unfair to fair, famine to feast. You are not simply burning down the forest to plant a garden, Adanse stated to Shango. Well, those words are certainly beautiful. Do you have any proof that such a thing would even work for this situation? The judge above all judges asked the daughter of a journalist. I only have two pieces of evidence. They better be certainly sure, as certain as the seasons and as sure as kniches rise. My first piece of evidence is that it hasn't been tried before, so we do not know if it will work. A large part of justice and the court system is establishing precedent. Every law written was a new question at one point. Something without precedent that sets precedents for the future. Think of it as the first drop of rain in a thunderstorm. Something so small it may never be noticed, and yet what follows shakes the heavens, heaves the ground, and stirs the oceans. Surely a god of thunder would understand the importance of the first drop in a storm. Adansi asked the god, who nodded sagely, his hands steepled. There is wisdom in what you say. I can see why you brought my wife back to me. She had so much strength, and yet the first thing to break her was less than a drop before a storm. I wish I had seen it before, and there is certainly great wisdom in giving precedence. I am intrigued. That does not mean you have my support in your little plan. It is dangerous and highly likely to fail. Why would any god support you, let alone one as great and terrible as me? The elder god asked the small child. Because you are as certain as I am that an empty throne is far deadlier than no throne at all. Adansi told the god of thunder, who was silenced by her words. Not just in his words, but also his body, his thoughts. Even the skies above were silent from Adansi's words. No birds, no bugs, no wind. Even the distant waves of the sea sounded silent. The ancient god was silent before he whispered. What makes you certain that there are empty thrones in Psipolis? The scared man asked the Marquess of Madness. When you lock gods out of their temples, that leaves their thrones empty. When you leave their temples empty, how long before something else takes their place? She asked Shango, who turned away to face his temple. The wind returned, and that gave Adansi her answer. In the Temple of Justice, where the god of justice stood beneath the patriarch's shadow, Shango would support her, and now, with the support of all of the gods of Stromer, the goddess of crossroads could begin to create a fifth path.